Okay, so I'm supposed to moderate the evening, and I'll lay out how it's going to proceed. We're going to spend about an hour in moderated conversation. And since we're talking about ethics, we're all going to be good up here. And then we'll have about a 5 or 10 minute break just after 8 o'clock. And then we're going to reconvene until 9 for some Q&A. You will be able to text. Are you going to give instructions later about texting questions? Or okay, so we will. Oh, so it's right up there.
Yep.
For texting. And I'll alternate between then or taking questions from the floor as well. So why don't we begin? The title on the poster referenced justifying moral claims, which is a question of moral epistemology or moral knowledge. Now that's a way into the conversation, but in fact the conversation we're going to be exploring is significantly broader than that. It's really the question of laying out two different worldviews, two different perspectives on the nature of morality, the nature of moral value, moral obligation, the good life. Some questions like that. One perspective will be theistic and the other will be atheistic.
It will actually not presuppose either theism or atheism, but thanks very much.
Duly noted. Thank you, Harold. So with having said that, I want to begin with the question of meaning and sort of back into the question of morality by way of the question of meaning. Now there's a famous story that I often hear from Christian apologists really like this story, and it's a famous story in Western philosophy. It's told by Nietzsche, and it describes the famous parable of the Madman, about a man who comes into a village looking for God, and all the villagers laugh at him. And then he says, in fact, God is dead and we have killed him. And he gives this eloquent reflection on the fact that without God, everything changes. I've heard that story often with respect to the claim that without God, one does not have a meaningful existence. And I think this is a way to begin to back into the question of ethics. I'd like to begin with Andy to get your reaction, your thoughts on Nietzsche's famous story.
On Nietzsche's famous story. So thank you, Randall, for that introduction, and thank you, Howard, for being willing to have tonight's dialogue. And actually, before I dive into answering that, very quick advertisement. Behind Howard, behind Dr. Nye, you'll see a Google link, if you can read that. That will take you to Howard's kind of handout for this evening. And over here, I'm not as flashy as Google links, but I do have a more memorable one, andybannister.net, which will also give you mine. One of these days I will work out Google links, but Google always takes my details and seems to make money out of me and never offers me anything in return. No meaning to be found with Google. So Nietzsche's parable of a madman. That's an interesting way in around to the conversation, and I think the question of meaning is bound up with the question of goodness. And that's bound up with the question of morality, and that's bound up with the question of purpose. And I suspect as Howard and I dialogue and as Randall navigates us through this conversation tonight, those themes are going to come together. And what I think Nietzsche was getting at in that parable, and one of the things I like immensely about reading Nietzsche, he's one of the most readable atheists, actually, whether you agree with him or not. He can spin a paragraph like almost no other. He was getting at the idea that as he saw it, coming at this from someone who didn't believe in God, that whether you believe in God or whether you don't believe in God, some things change. Because there are some things that are predicated on belief in God. And actually Nietzsche goes on in that parable to describe the fact that without God, as he put it, the horizon is washed away. There is no longer any up or down or left or right. We have no bearings, and we're actually to the left to create meaning and create reality for ourselves. And actually when Randall told me he was going to open with the parable of the madman, that was interesting because in my sort of opening comments, I drew some quotes together for this evening thinking I'd probably draw on them. One of my favorite quotations in Nietzsche sort of ties into that, Randall, and it's where Nietzsche says in Twilight of the Idols, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. And when you break one concept, you break the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. And so in answer to the question of meaning, I think I would say, yes, while it may be possible to have individual meaning, I can go out and decide that helping the poor or collecting stamps or supporting the Leafs, especially maybe not the last one, is personally meaningful for me. What I can't do is then build out from that. If you have a worldview that disagrees with me, if you have a meaning that I find abominable, perhaps you decide your meaning in life is, pulling the wings off insects or or torturing Maple Leafs fans or something, I actually have no basis to say, well, hang on a minute, there's a problem with your meaning. All I can really say is, here's my meaning. What's yours? And I think if the Christian worldview is true, that offers us a platform to go, actually, there is a higher level of meaning that enables us now to begin having some of these meta-ethical, meta-meaning kind of conversations. So I think Nietzsche was broadly right, as was Bertrand Russell, Albert Camus, and many others we might introduce into tonight's conversation. So yeah, I think things do change if there is no God.
And I'm guessing you disagree.
That is correct, yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say thank you so much for inviting me tonight and so much for having this discussion. I think that in our cultural environment of really out of control tribalism, it's so important for people with differing views to come together and have reasoned discussions. Also, I don't know if everyone's had a chance to try the pizza. It is vegan, and you know, one of the reasons is that because eating plant-based foods is so much less environmentally destructive, so much more efficient. It leaves so much many more resources for others. And of course, it doesn't involve the animal welfare issues about industrialized farming. It really is trying to use plant-based as you can, and and ideally going entirely vegan is really one of the best things I think that we can do, and I'm not sure everyone's aware of it. So I have at the top of the handout, I've got some resources there just on the empirical realities of this sort of thing. And so I think that what Andy and I are going to talk about tonight is the really philosophically, ethically, theoretically interesting stuff about how we justify sort of the fundamental basic ethical assumptions, right? But I do think that this kind of thing, as is shown in the links at the top of the handout, of just using, you know, ethical assumptions we all share, given certain kinds of empirical things we can learn about the world, about the effects that we're having on it, and ways we can not have those effects or mitigate them, that is a very practically important way of justifying ethical claims like that it would really be good to be as plant-based as possible. Right, so yeah, so I disagree with Nietzsche, and I suppose Russell at certain phases of his development, and certainly with Camus and others. So I think there's sort of two parts to my view. One is a negative case about why I think it is a mistake to think that ethics in any way depends on religion, on whether there is a God. And the other is how, you know, making clear how we can justify ethical claims without God. And I actually think that's a method that of rational, reflective, critical scrutiny that we're all, in fact, quite familiar with, and I have some examples that I can walk through. Would it be best if I maybe gave a short rundown on why I think ethics does not depend, the sort of negative case for why I think ethics does not depend on whether there's a God?
Well, before we get there,
Yeah.
to how about just meaning? So this claim that if there is no God, there is no objective meaning. Meaning is in the eye of the beholder.
I'm going to talk about objective ethical truth, objective truths about what there's reason to do, what is intrinsically good or bad, beneficial or harmful, what is intrinsically morally right and wrong. I'm not really, those are the questions I work on that I'm familiar with. I'm not really sure what meaning in this context means. Forgive me.
Sure. I'll give it an example.
I think meaning can mean a whole bunch of different things. I mean, I think that one thing I suspect. I mean, you know, sometimes it just means. I think people use. You know, it's really meaningful to the 6-month-old to have her favorite toy and things like that. There, I think we're talking about just kind of a psychological depth of joy and appreciation and comfort, and you know how it can engage her and she can really get into it. I take it that's not what you have in mind here. What I think you have in mind here is something like, what is the kind of you know, when you're thinking about what's, you know, meaning, you're thinking about what kind of life ought I to live, right? And that's fine. So yeah, I'm very happy to talk about that. That's what I'd like to talk about. But yeah, so I think, yeah, so I think that actually, you know, I'm going to call this, you know, ethical facts, so facts about what is in fact good and bad and reasonable and moral. I think that they are independent from whether God exists in 3 ways. First of all, they're metaphysically independent. They're not facts. So facts about what is in fact good or right are not in fact facts about what God approves of, or they're not facts that involve God. They're just a very different kind of fact. I think that they're practically or motivationally independent. I think that our reasons to care about morality do not depend on whether God exists. And I also think they're epistemically independent. I think that the way we know what's in itself good and bad and right and wrong does not depend on our views about God and what God commands and approves. I think that, in fact, we have to first figure out what is ethically right and wrong, and that's the only way to appropriately interpret claims about what God, in fact, approves and commands. So I could give you arguments for all of that, but I don't want to hog this. So, would you like me to give an argument for one part of that?
How about we go at this point, since we've talked about knowledge and God. So let's. Alvin Plantinga has an argument, and C.S. Lewis has a similar argument. Many people have made a similar argument. Arguably, Descartes made a similar argument, that in some way our knowledge, our moral knowledge, requires the existence of God.
Our knowledge of anything, if you're doing the Descartes one.
Yes, but sure. Moral knowledge being a subset thereof. So to take Plantinga's version of the argument very roughly, he claims that in a universe without, well, in fact, do you want to, is that an argument you're sympathetic with? I don't want to take
No,
it.
actually, I was going to say that's...
and then, Howard, you could give a rebuttal to it?
I'm a little worried about this because I do think that this isn't about morality per se. I think that this is just, in a sense, this is sort of a reason to, even if we weren't talking about morality, you're giving what would be a reason to talk about God. So I just want to talk about whether ethics in particular is kind of independent from God. I don't want to talk about general, I thought that was the point of the discussion.
I think it is, and I think it's actually one reason why we have Randall, because I think to keep this as a conversation which should be more engaging for folks. I think to take your point, Randall, I think that question's important, Howard, is I think actually sitting under and around questions around ethics, which we are certainly going to cover this evening, because I know you have a lot to say on that, and so do I think some very important questions that are also sort of provide a framework for that. One of them is, of course, if we're going to talk about moral knowledge or any kind of knowledge, is that question you're alluding to, Randall, which is Alvin Plantinga, who's a Christian philosopher, but others have put forward the very question of how is it if we live in a purely materialistic, naturalistic universe,
by the way,
we can know nothing at all.
That doesn't have to do with atheism. You can be a non-naturalist and be an atheist.
If I may just finish,
sorry,
Howard, on that point. And actually, thank you, because that segued me into exactly where I was going to go. That's certainly for Christians, that argument has been popularized by Plantinga, the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Actually, my go-to first person on it is a gentleman called Raymond Tallis. And Raymond Tallis wrote a wonderful book called Aping Mankind, Neurophilia, Darwinitis, and the Reduction of Humanity. And Raymond's fascinating because he's an atheist, he's a neuroscientist, and he's a philosopher. And his argument is, his whole book, his 500-page book, is an argument against metaphysical naturalism. And his argument is, unless we have some way of actually grounding human reason, we have a problem. And here's the problem in a nutshell. If your minds right now are just producing the thoughts that are going on in them because of a series of physical processes, you do not have reason. What you have is brain chemistry, and you have determination of cause and effect, but you don't have reason. And it's a fascinating book because he's got no theistic argument, axe to grind. And what's interesting, my original background years ago, although I used part of it in my PhD research, is computer science. And there's computers have caused a lot of confusion here because we think computers are rational. But actually they aren't. They follow algorithmic logic, and you put nonsense in one end, you get nonsense out the other, and the computer doesn't know otherwise. And there's a huge question around how we can actually know any truths at all in a purely godless, atheistic, naturalistic universe. And so I think your question is an interesting one in terms of moral knowledge, which we'll come to.
Yeah. Okay, I think so the question of whether God exists is a distinct question from whether minds are material, and it's also a distinct question from whether there are any other kinds of non-natural facts, like maybe facts about math and logic. In fact, I'm very sympathetic to physicalism and the philosophy of mind. I'm actually very sympathetic to Platonism, or sort of the idea that truths about math and logic are not naturalistic truths in the philosophy of math and logic. But that's just, I honestly, I'm sorry, but I just think that's going to take us way too far off topic. Although it will be relevant because one of the views, a leading view about what ethical facts are, is not a metaethical non-naturalism. It's actually on the very last page of your handout, and is the view that, in fact, like facts about math and logic, which are completely fundamental, irreducible to anything that's studied by the natural sciences or anything else. In fact, ethical facts are like that. And there have been tons and tons of non-naturalists who have not been theists. Some of the great Sidgwick to Ewing school ethicists like J.M.E. McTaggart. He was an idealist and a non-naturalist, but also a passionate atheist. So I mean, these things and many of the contemporary non-naturalists like Derek Parfit, Jeff McMahon, David Enoch, I think that most, if not maybe, I haven't talked to them about their theistic views, I'm sorry, but I think most of them are actually atheists. So I'm not here to defend metaphysical naturalism. I'm not even sure I agree with it. And that would just be a way different conversation than I think what we want to have tonight. So would you like me to give an argument for why I think ethics doesn't depend on God?
So how about the Euthyphro, or the way that you would like to, the way that you find the Euthyphro compelling, introduce what the argument is and how you understand it.
So so I think a nice way to show that ethical facts don't depend on God, or that ethical facts aren't just facts about God. Let's assume that God exists and that God only commands all and only what's right and loves all and only what's good. There's two possibilities of what might be going on here, right? It might be that all there is to something being right or good is that God happens to command or love it. That would be the view often called theological volunteerism. That's, I think, a standard way of thinking that ethical facts depend on God. The other view is that no, ethical facts are something, not just mere facts about God's attitudes. God is omniscient and righteous and good, and God sees what is independently right and good and commands and loves accordingly. That would be the kind of metaphysical independence thesis that, for example, someone like I would like to advance. And I think a good way to see the Euthyphro problem, it's on your handout, it's on the first page, for theological volunteerism is that to adequately make sense of God's goodness and righteousness, I think we have to reject theological volunteerism and have the independence thesis. And why? Well, here's two brief reasons. So ask the question, would it be good and right to torture children to death just for fun with the certainty of no future benefits coming from it if God were to command and love it? Well, if you're a good traditional theist, I think you should say God could never command such a thing because God is good and right, and that would not be consistent with God's morally perfect nature. The problem for a theological voluntarist is that they can't say that. Because if God were to love and command child torture, completely unredeemed child torture, it would in fact be good and right, because there'd be nothing more than, to something be good or right than God's arbitrary loves and commands. So I think that can't be right. Also, theological voluntarism destroys the traditional reasons that are given to obey God's commands. So one of the, for example, you can walk through it with any of the reasons, but one example is duties of gratitude. So the standard idea is, look, we have duties to repay benefactors, right? So we should obey God because it's right to repay benefactors, and God is a benefactor. But for theological voluntarists, all that means is we should obey God's commands because it's right to repay benefactors, and God is one. That just means we should obey God's commands because God has commanded that we repay benefactors, and God is one. So it's not giving you an independent reason to obey God's commands above and beyond just the command, right? So for those reasons, I think that's not a decent way of making sense of reasons, of God's righteousness. We have to think that ethics is about something else, something that could, in principle, exist independent from God, which God is sort of commanding and loving in accordance with. I do think that this leads, what I just said about this theological voluntarism would destroy our reasons to care about what God loves and things, also kind of helps you get into the practical independence that.
Can we come to the practical independence?
We can come back to whether we should care about morality depending on God. We could talk more about that.
I'll just throw this back to you now, Andy. Hit the Euthyphro ball over into your
Get
court.
a word in edgeways like fish slice. And, so the Euthyphro back in
Howard's objection, as I understand it, is focused on a theological voluntarism, understanding that that moral values are a result in some sense of God's willing. Is that your view? And if not, what is your view?
And I'm not saying it is. It's just some ground clearing, right? Because I think it's been a historically popular view. Yeah.
I'll tell you what. Let me map out my view, and you map out yours.
Good. That'd be nice.
So I think I think the Euthyphro dilemmas are fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is it helps Christians think more clearly, because I completely agree, actually I tend to largely agree with Howard, that taking the position that something is good just because God happens to randomly command it gets you in all kinds of problems. And actually my background is in Quranic studies, and actually for many of the classical Muslim philosophers that was the position that was taken. Al-Ghazali and others, for example, end up in there. I don't think it's an option for Christians. What's interesting and not often spotted about the Euthyphro dilemma, it actually slices quite nicely through a whole number of attempts to ground morality. So it's sometimes used, sometimes in a more sophisticated way, sometimes in a lazier way by atheists or by skeptics. But you can apply it to other things. So for example, if you come across somebody who says, well, moral values are determined by society, you can run the Euthyphro dilemma. Does society determine which is good just because it's whatever society says? So if society says, like the Third Reich, go out and kill the Jews and gypsies and so forth, it becomes good? Or is there something external to society? You can do the same thing for someone like Professor Dawkins, who says, well, it's our DNA, it's our genetics, it's the selfish gene. Does that command the good because it's just what is whatever that your genes command you to do is good, and vice versa? So I think what the Euthyphro dilemma causes us to think about is quite long and hard on where do we ground what we think is moral, and actually is it really located where it is? What's also interesting, of course, is I think the Euthyphro dilemma also helps Christians see more clearly what is it that the Bible is saying in terms of the God, certainly, of the New Testament and of Jesus Christ, of what his understanding of goodness is. And of course, the Christian answer to the Euthyphro dilemma has been since ancient times, it's God's character is what determines the good, and God commands in keeping with his character. That's why God doesn't just voluntarily and arbitrarily say, you know what, poking cycling philosophers in the eye is a good idea, or so on and so forth. And so for Christians, it concerns God's character and God's nature is where that's located. But the Euthyphro dilemma itself, I think, is helpful, because whether you're an atheist or a theist, it actually cuts through a lot of quite sloppy thinking around morality and goodness.
Okay, so I'll come back to you in just a second to get you to respond to whether appealing to character is
I
adequate.
didn't understand how that response was supposed to go, quite honestly. But yeah, if you want to do something else.
One thing I want to push back a little bit, Andy, on,
Absolutely.
and you feel free to jump in on that, and then we'll come back to your dissatisfaction with that answer. And that's that you're not just arguing for an abstract theism. As you just said,
exactly.
You're arguing for the God of Judeo-Christian tradition,
Yes,
which is revealed in Scripture. And God, as revealed in Scripture, seems to command some things that people think are heinous today. For example, in 1 Samuel 15:3, God commands the eradication of an entire people, the Amalekites, even the infants. So
there's 12 other cases like that.
Sure, yeah, Deuteronomy 20,
And
Deuteronomy
also to
7.
take the girls as sex slaves. And
Numbers 31
right,
you'd be appealing to. So how would you respond to these problems, that even if there is a God, that the character revealed in Scripture is not an accurate representation of who that God is?
Yeah, well, I would say there are a number of ways you can go on this. One, first of all, I think we need to make sure we're understanding the text correctly, as you would recognise there, Randall. So I think by far, one of the best resources to go to on there would be someone like Paul Copan, who's a philosopher and an exegete. His book is God, a Moral Monster, because one of the issues with those texts is we're separated from them by 2,500 or 3,000 years or 3,000 years of time and culture, and we need to be careful to read them in their context. The sex slave comment is a case in point. That is not what those texts are saying, if you read them carefully.
Look, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to
No, I'm not. I'm not offended in the slightest, but I am, and because
is concubine not?
I've had to learn this in the same way when I read the Islamic texts, not to read them through my Christian frame, but to be careful to read the text in terms of what it's actually saying. And also, of course, the other thing that I think is often misread in those Old Testament texts is God's primary command to the Israelites there was to drive the Canaanites from the land. And there's a very strong moral connection there, which is interesting, because here we are talking about morality. If you remember in Genesis chapter 19, where the land of Canaan is promised to Abraham, God specifically says to Abraham, until the sin of the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and those peoples of that part of the world has run full course, you and your descendants will go into slavery in Egypt for 430 years, until the time is right for judgment to come. So there is a question around whether God has the right to judge. And I think that raises a whole series of questions. It raises some challenging questions for Christians. It also raises some challenging questions for atheists, because I think one of the wisest thinkers on this, one of the most helpful thinkers for me on this, is the Balkan theologian and philosopher Miroslav Volf, And Miroslav, for those who are unfamiliar with him, grew up in the Balkans, comes from a people who have experienced horrific genocide and persecution, and all kinds of horrors have gone on in Eastern Europe. And Miroslav, who has written on a whole range of issues connected with that, makes this observation. He said, if you do not believe in a God of judgment, then when you are faced with injustice of the kind of injustice my people have been faced with, you are faced with one or two choices. You either have to just assume that somebody will sort the problem out. You say, we'll trust the United Nations or something to put it right. Well, that's naivety. That doesn't work. We've seen how well that works out. Or, he said, you take vengeance into your own hands. You burned my village, we'll burn your village. You raped my sister, I'll rape your sister, and so on and so forth. And
Why
he said,
not try to find peaceful solutions?
One moment, Howard.
Sorry.
And what Miroslav would say, when you look around the world today, the biggest problem we have is the spiral of violence. I agree with you. Try to find peaceful solutions. Look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Look at the Balkans. Look at Somalia. Look at many of the troubled spots of the world, because that spiral of violence goes round and round and round. And Miroslav ends up that article saying that if you truly believe in a God of justice, if you truly believe there will be a day of judgment, and you really believe that to the fiber of your being, then you can allow and leave vengeance to him. You do not need to take revenge. Unless you believe something like that, yeah, we can come up with all kind of sophisticated ideas. Here we are in Edmonton, let's have this sort of ivory tower view of it. But actually, if you look at the reality on the ground, we need a way to break that spiral of violence. So Miroslav Volf, exclusion and embrace.
Okay,
is
so
the go-to
Howard, first of all,
Yeah.
you're satisfied with that, and then
No,
come back to character and Euthyphro.
In various ways, I'm deeply unsatisfied. So, I mean, so first of all, I think that let me just speak to the very last thing. Just the recognition. Well, I mean, first of all, I think there are good reasons to think that vengeance is not worth having in and of itself anyway. But even if it were a bit, I mean, just realizing that there's a cycle of violence, that seems like good enough reason not to take revenge, whatever you think about what will happen in the hereafter. So I'm sorry, I just didn't understand how that argument was supposed to work. But then,
well, let me just interrupt there. My question is: here you are. Let's imagine we can teleport you now. Sorry,
He'll just run through his thought, and you can offer
yes, okay,
rebuttal
all right,
again.
fair enough.
Yeah. So, I really liked what Andy said about we can't take the texts at face value. Is that?
I said we need no. I said we need to read the texts in their context and read them properly, is what I said.
So here's what so this is part of the argument from epistemological independence, that I think we actually have to use our ethical knowledge to understand what's worth following or what's worth taking seriously and what would be accurate about religious texts' portrayal of a righteous and loving God. So, so jump to the second bit. In practice, how do you deal with divine endorsements of things like genocide or killing young children? Sorry if you don't think it's rape. We could talk about that later. And of course, there's also apparent endorsements of the authors of Old and New Testaments of things like slavery, or at least acquiescing in slavery, and women not teaching or holding positions of authority, and so on. So I think that, and maybe Andy disagrees, but I think that our only options are either one, to hold that in some of these cases, first of all, it's to recognize that these texts are very indeterminate about what practical guidance we're supposed to take from them, and I think we need tons of secular ethical reasoning to get that. But first of all, we could say with these ones that really seem flagrant, look, the author's human fallibility rather than their accurately discerning divine revelation was what is in part responsible for the text. I thought that was a good resource that people could say, it's divinely inspired, but, it was divinely revealed to fallible humans who can get things wrong. The second thing I guess you can say is that there were local customs or exigencies which, unlike, for example, the injunctions to do unto others as we had them do unto us, to love our neighbors as ourselves, and to care for the least amongst us, are no longer in effect. The question, though, is how do you tell which ones are which? And I think that it's inescapable that the way we know that God would still want us to love our neighbor and care for the poor, but doesn't still want us to do things like engage in genocide in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or what have you, or accept slavery or subjugate women, is that our secular ethical reasoning endorses, the love your neighbor stuff, and it opposes the genocide stuff. I think there's a more in principle argument for why you have to use your secular ethical reasoning to pick and interpret texts. So I have on the handout this case of the descriptively ideal but ethically repugnant text. So it's a hypothetical hypothetical thought experiment. Suppose we found a text which our best evidence told us was written at the beginning of time, was perfectly transmitted, and which actually predicted with perfect accuracy every detail of everything we would ever observe, and our best science told us to be true. But suppose that this text also contained pronouncements like that it is right, good, and loved and commanded by God to torture completely innocent children to death for fun when this will bring about no further good consequences, which it assures us it will not. And you can, if you'd like, you can imagine pages and pages of like God loves and approves of depriving everyone of innocent joy and knowledge and good achievement, and achievement that would bring explanatory valuable knowledge and the relief of suffering. And God loves and approves of that simply because there will be nothing further from it. Okay, so I think that it's clear that in this case, the descriptive ideality of the text is no evidence whatsoever for concluding that its ethical claims or claims about the attitudes of a good and righteous God are true. If you had to hypothesize in it, the best hypotheses would be something like, well, this was most likely produced by super intelligent but not ethically authoritative authors, maybe aliens, maybe fallen angels, what have you, or somehow when there was divine inspiration, the descriptive stuff got through, but the ethical stuff just totally got distorted, what have you. And in any event, these authors weren't accurately reporting the genuine attitudes of a good and righteous God. So I think that whatever we say about how these things were transmitted or cultural context or whatever, it really is going to come down to, look, these texts are written. Am I supposed to believe that they're revelatory of the divine? I think the only option at the end of the day, fundamentally, is are their pronouncements going to be supported by secular, independent, critical reasoning?
Okay, Andy, can you give a quick response to that if you want to? And then briefly restate, because it's been a while now since we heard it, your response to the Euthyphro so that we can have Howard then respond to that because he wasn't satisfied with that either. So can you give a brief response to his argument, restate your resolution of the Euthyphro?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think in terms of responding to kind of Howard's sort of theoretical text from aliens, I think one of the interesting questions for me in terms of this idea that there is a sort of neutral kind of secular reasoning, I have huge questions with. So apologies.
I'd like to talk about it.
Well,
yeah.
we will talk about it. So apologies for interrupting you, but then you interrupted me. So this is fun. This is sparky. I like spark. No, sparking is good.
It's that cycle of violence you're talking about.
Cycle of violence. Yeah, exactly. But I'll tell you what. We'll have vegan pizzas at 30 yards, and we'll see. Those things can really fly. I think a number of things are happening for me. I think one of the huge tests of a piece of ethical reasoning is how it works in the real world. Is how that actually works in the real world. And I think it's very, very easy, especially for those of us who love philosophy, to philosophize in our ivory towers. But actually, when you get out onto the ground, when you go and stand and you talk with the victims, when you actually go and wade and roll up your sleeves and wade into the mess of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or what went on in the Balkans or other sort of trouble spots of the world right now and say, hey, all we need to do is we have these kind of neutral, sort of free-floating, lovely secular ethical theories. Wouldn't it all be wonderful if we sat around and ate vegan pizzas and made daisy chains and traded pictures of unicorns? It doesn't actually work in the real world, and so many ethical theories break down in the real world. In fact, one of the most helpful books, I think, on this whole subject is Michael Sandel out of Yale University's book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? It's a fairly gentle but merciless walk through the major ethical theories, and one of his conclusions is how badly these things actually stand up in the real world of reality of pain and suffering and tears. It's my first issue. Second issue, I think the idea that we have some sort of secular, sort of neutral, independent platform that we can stand upon to gaze wisely and sagely down upon the masses of the world and go, well, if only they knew what we knew from this point. This was Nietzsche's point of actually attacking that arrogance and that sense of superiority that he saw in many Westerners and go, well, hold on a moment, actually things aren't secure as you think. For example, one of the things that often goes on in sort of in so-called sort of neutral secular reasoning is you end up privileging something. You either privilege perhaps sort of vague sorts of things like human flourishing, or you pick out some other virtue and you would go for that, or you privilege human beings. which is interesting. That happens in things like humanism, for example. One of the things I admire actually Howard for is that you're committed to things like your animal rights. You're quite unusual in that you and Peter Singer and others, although Peter's got himself in trouble with some of where he's...
I can tell you why. I'll tell you a bit about why he's wrong about some of that stuff tonight.
We'll come into that. And so what's interesting is that actually this independent neutrality I'm not sure exists. I think for ethical reasoning to happen, one of the first things you need to actually lay out in the open is actually what you think human flourishing looks like and what you think human ends are. Which leads me nicely to your question about Euthyphro, and angling back to that for Christians, and you're absolutely right, that I don't stand here as just some vague theist, I stand here as a Christian thinker, that ultimately it's about the character of God, about who God is, and of course Christians believe that character is most clearly and supremely and directly and personally expressed in the person of Jesus. And that isn't just a case of revealing God and what he is like to us, but also the challenge there for Christian life is about being shaped and modeled into the image of Jesus. And to answer that question about the pursuit and the end of ethics for Christians, it's to be more Christ-like. That is the purpose, that is the telos, that is what human flourishing looks like. And I think you need to begin by answering what does a good life look like before you can actually answer some of these other ethical questions, because otherwise you can't actually determine between a good life, a life well lived, a life wasted, and a bad life.
So can you respond to the Euthyphro, which was about character, and then we'll come back to human flourishing?
Because I think it was going in a really nice direction in that Andy was sort of saying, well, can you really just do this secular ethical reasoning? And I'd like to kind of give examples of how that works and how you prove Peter Singer wrong about infanticide. So I'm not saying I have to do that right now, but I would like to get to that. I'm sorry, I just don't see how the character response was supposed to work. So first of all, I agree. I really like the Sermon on the Mount. I really like a lot of what Jesus says. I think I know that he also says, I come with the sword. I think that the way we're, some people said, okay, we got to interpret that as like Deus Vult, let's go against, the heathens, and that's wrong. And I think we know that's not the right way to interpret Christ. And it's about love your neighbor, it's about help the poor. That's, again, by our secular ethical reasoning. I agree that Christ's character look, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert. I was raised Reformed Jewish, so I don't know a ton about I know about Christianity mostly from my Great Book seminar that I took in as an undergraduate and from my Christian friends. I agree that many aspects of Christ's character are wonderfully virtuous, but I think the way we know that, I think that the reason that's so is not that sort of Christ just arbitrarily was this way, right? It's that there is this kind of character, which is a benevolent and helping, caring, and willing to self-sacrifice character, and that is good. And Christ is good not just because Christ is however Christ constituted himself. Christ is good because Christ has these independent properties which could in principle have existed without Christ. So I just don't see how it's in any way a response to the Euthyphro. So you said after saying how I didn't think it was a response.
Then we could talk about human flourishing.
Oh, human flourishing. Oh, yeah. Sorry. So maybe and you cut me off if I'm going too long. But so I totally agree. When I talk about secular ethical reasoning, and maybe I should get into it a bit. I in no way think that that's restricted to just claims about what's right and wrong independent of value. I think that secular ethical reasoning is going to reveal that the most fundamental moral principles are things like all else held equal, there are reasons not to harm others which are proportional to the degree of harm involved. What is harm? There you go. That's a well-being question, and and I think secular reasoning has a ton to say about that. And my brief against Singer, for example, here I could give you if you'd like, is exactly that secular ethical reasoning can show that death is a harm to infants and at least some fetuses. And that because it's a harm, that carries enormous ethical weight. So I totally agree that secular ethics, we have to, in order to answer these ethical questions, we absolutely have to be answering the questions about value. And it's just secular ethics has been talking about value. It has been for thousands. I mean, the Greeks were like, what is the good life? That's where we're going to start. I mean, I don't do it quite the same way they do, but believe me, I'm interested in well-being. Believe me, I'm interested in questions of what constitutes value, what exactly is intrinsically valuable. And I've got all sorts of stuff in the handout about arguments and how you make the case for certain things being harms or not. But I don't want to go on too long. Would it be okay if I start illustrating how some secular ethics can work? Or
I'd like to talk about obligation, and then I think we can sort of, as we round out our first hour, we can sort of come to some practical differences in how we apply ethical reasoning, which you could get to that point. So in terms of obligation, so one big part of ethics, of course, is moral value, the good and the bad. Another big part is obligation, or the right and the wrong. So what I ought to do, what I ought not to do. Some Christians have argued, C. Stephen Evans being one of them recently in a book on meta-ethics, even if the Euthyphro is successful with respect to the good, there is still an independent argument from the existence of moral obligation that it is best explained with appeal to God. So if you'd like to give a response to your understanding of moral obligation, and you as well, Andy.
So I think that the reason I think that's not an attractive view is because I think that whatever's really weird and mysterious about moral obligation is also exactly what's weird and mysterious about the good, right? So if you're willing to sort of say, look, we need God-independent facts about the good to get us going, which as I understand, and we're only going to use theological volunteerism on the right. I just don't see the point. I mean, like, with the good, it's one of those things where you say, look, it can't just be arbitrary. We want to know. But also with the right, I mean, so I've got things on the handout, for instance, of, look, if you try to say, get obligation going, I mean, from God, usually it's like, oh, well, we have an obligation to obey God. So this is, I guess, the practical independence parts. So if we're going to have non-self-interested reasons to obey God, right? So non-self-interested reasons to be moral either don't really depend on God's existence, or they're no better justified than reasons to be moral that don't. So for example, on the handout, the claim that we should be moral to advance God's plan, which will benefit others. And that presupposes that others being benefited is itself a direct reason to act, independent of God's existence. And I think if you think about those reasons, if you think about sort of how powerful those reasons are in comparison to other things, you can formulate principles, after more critical reflection, like, I guess what I have, it's the strong, so the weak on page 3, the weak requiring force of beneficence, all else held equal if we can prevent serious harm to others or benefit others at what would be in comparison relatively trivial harms to ourselves, we're morally required to do so. So just from these duties to help others, just from these reasons to help others, we're already talking about moral reasons, and all moral obligation is, people talk about special obligations, but all the basic category of moral requirement is when the moral reasons are decisive, and they decisively determine that you should feel obligated to help, to do the thing, and they're decisive in what to do. And I could give you an explanation of why they're decisive in what to do, but I don't want to go on too. Yeah. So I think there's no the general meta-ethical, theoretical, metaphysical, epistemological questions about value and about the right. They're exactly parallel. So if you're not going to be if we realize that theological voluntarism doesn't work for value, there's no reason to think it's going to work for rightness. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of stuff to dig into there. First thing I want to say, it's interesting, a couple of things that came out of what you said that I think are helpful just to reinforce for folks who may have missed them, because you covered so much ground there. I think the first interesting thing that you're kind of hinting at there is this idea, and you said right at the beginning actually that you're potentially drawn to Platonism, this idea that moral reality... Well, hang on.
About math, not necessarily.
Well,
but
yeah.
I'm sympathetic to both.
Sympathetic. Thank you. Okay, sympathetic. I love engaging with philosophers. The language is so precise. So the interesting thing for those who aren't aware, of course, what Platonism is, it gives this realm of objects, certainly numbers, and possibly now moral values that are floating out there independently. And of course, this raises the question of where you locate this. And one of the moves that Christian philosophers like Augustine and others did in the kind of great synthesis was to say, well, you know what, the most obvious place to locate this realm of sort of things that floating around mysteriously and don't reduce to atoms and particles and whatnots is actually into the mind of God. But obligation that you talked about, I think that's hugely important actually, or another way to put a word on it is duty. Because we don't actually think about this enough. We're so trained in our culture to think about the language of rights. My rights, my rights. But of course, there's a problem here, quite frankly, because if Howard or Randall, are sort of banging on about rights, and I come up and start digging them around the head with a piece of vegan pizza, and Howard says, but hang on a minute, I have a human right not to be clobbered around the head with a piece of artichoke. And I say, well, you very well may. I don't care. Why should that compel me? And the whole question of rights and duties is all around how do we compel someone to behave a certain way? How can we tell somebody, how can we compel someone who is behaving abominably that you should do X or you should do Y? And here you actually get to the heart of one of the oldest dilemmas in ethics, the so-called is-ought dilemma, also known as the naturalistic fallacy, goes back to philosophers like David Hume, G.E. Moore, and others, and which says that the most common mistakes we make as human beings is to say because something is, it ought to be the case. Because it is the fact that if you poke your friend in the eye, they suffer harm, you ought not to do that. But of course, that raises the question: why not? What is actually wrong with causing harm? It's all very well for the person receiving harm to go, I do not like having harm done to me. The person doing harm can go, yeah, but I actually enjoy it. Thanks very much. Have another piece of artichoke. Poke in the eye. And the question of responsibility is a hugely important one. It also, I think, shifting the language onto responsibility also cuts through a big dilemma we have in our culture right now. One of the huge dilemmas I see in Western culture particularly is we tend to play this game of rights one-upmanship. We try to find ways to say, well, I have this special set of rights because I belong to this particular subclass of people, or this particular minority group, and then this minority group over here go, well, I have this set of rights, well, we have this set of rights. And how do you trade these things off against each other? You have a sort of cascading set of rights, almost like, a poker hand. Shifting it to responsibility raises all kinds of questions. Why do I think human responsibility exists? One reason, not the only one, isn't just because God sort of randomly commands it, but I actually think two things. I think human beings have value, and I touched on this at the start. Does Howard have a value that this glass of water doesn't? Now, obviously, I assume he thinks he does, but the glass of water, if we could ask it, may have an opinion on this subject as well.
Are you attributing mental states to it? Because if it does, then I think we
could be somewhere. Yes, exactly.
Value, yeah.
But even having mental states is interesting because that raises the question of what about human beings who don't? And I know you're doing work in this area who have functional disparament in that area.
There's still plenty of mental states,
and so on and so forth. But even if you say mental states is what gives me value, that still rather looks suspiciously like me saying I have mental states, therefore I have value. And to go, no one in this audience would have any sympathy if you or I said we are white men, and because of that we have a certain value that comes from being of that gender and that racial background. And it looks rather like special pleading. How do we can come to this in a moment. Where does value come from is a very, very interesting question. And of course the Christian answer to that has traditionally been because we are made in the image of God. We bear the imago Dei. And then, to bring this to a close for my answer on this, then the question of purpose and telos that I think you touched on a moment ago. There is this question we really can't escape, which is there something that human beings were actually intended to be? And I mentioned earlier Michael Sandel and his book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? Lovely little quote from Michael where he says, debates about justice and rights are often, unavoidably, debates about the purpose of societal institutions, the goods they allocate, the virtues they honour and reward. Despite our best efforts to make the law neutral on these questions, it may not be possible to say what is just and right without first arguing about the nature of the good life and what the telos of human life, the purpose of human life is. And my word, that's a whole other interesting discussion.
Okay, we've only got about 5 minutes before we're going to take a break, so you need to have your time to respond, and then I'd like to have like a quick, maybe a minute or so from each of you on one final question.
So I think that if the question is what ought the purpose to be, then that's fine. I totally agree that we have to, that's the kind of question. But if you just sort of say, well, oh no, it's like there is this antecedent purpose, and that totally is what gives the value. No. Because if we were created by some sort of, if it wasn't God that created us, if it was some sort of malevolent deity that created us just to suffer and count blades of grass or something. That would, but it wasn't like it was going to punish us if we didn't do that. That would be no reason whatsoever to actually go ahead and try to make ourselves suffer and count blades of grass. If God's intentions would only be relevant because God is good and God intends what's good. But then the question about purpose just reduces to just the question about what's good. So I don't think purchase, independent of just questions about what ought you to do, what is good, I don't think it gets any purchase. The bit about, so there's a lot about how do you defend these claims about value. Have lots of illustrations on the handout. I guess I didn't get a chance to walk through any of them with you, but maybe I'll just do this. I think that when you think about it, the idea that someone could actually be benefited or harmed, but we don't have to care about that because they're not cool enough. I think that if you reflect on it, this involves a conflation of aesthetic and moral criteria, and this is one thing secular ethical reasoning can do. You can make these distinctions. Actually, when you reflect on it, I think I have it on the handout. It's a different version. Just because someone isn't as impressive as someone else, that doesn't seem that it has anything to do with the extent to which we should feel compassion towards them, or we should feel obligated to them to do something. That's not the way any kind of reasonable compassion or feelings of obligation would work. And when you sort of think about that with mental states, well, actually having being capable. I think if we think about a plausible set of things that are beneficial and harmful, good and bad, I think I have lots of arguments about experience machine, all sorts of stuff on the handout. But if you think about all the plausible things, enjoyment, rich experience, interesting knowledge that you get into, that you discover, difficult achievement, friendship, deep relationships. All these things require the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, sentience, the capacity to have subjective experiences. Anything that has those states, anything that has that kind of mental state can be benefited or harmed, and it would be indefensibly arbitrary, just as arbitrary as doing it on the basis of color or sex chromosomes or whatever, to think that individual's interests are less important. I think that that's the kind of thing that secular ethical reasoning can do. You have some proposed idea they're just not that cool, so we don't have to care about them. You think, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by cool? Why would that have anything to do with caring? Don't you see that principle is going to entail that if someone's a bit cooler than you, then their interests count for more? And do you really think that their interests count for more than you just because they're a bit cooler than you? That seems pretty implausible. And what should any of this have to do with care and compassion anyway, right? So that's the sort of thing that secular ethical reasoning can do. It doesn't involve beating people over the head with rights. It involves taking on board. You have proposals for what plausible, what makes something good or right. You think maybe that seems kind of plausible. Wait a minute, I got to make this distinction here. I gotta see what this implies in these cases here. I got to think about rival things. Oh, could something more fundamental, some more fundamental ethical idea? So okay, it's wrong we have a right to, right not to be killed. Well, why? What is it about? Why is the right not to be killed so big? Oh, well, maybe it's because death is an enormous harm because it deprives you of all future goods, or at least all future temporal goods. And then someone like or is it just because we want to keep living? Well, wait a minute. That's the kind of thing that Singer uses to try to say that death doesn't harm infants. Well, wait a minute. Why should it matter if you want? Don't you see that principle would imply that suicidally depressed people who would, if you just gave them a chance, they recover and they have these great lives just because they don't happen to want those lives right now? Death doesn't harm them, or teenagers who only want to be rock stars and aren't going to. It's not going to pan out, and they're if they survive, they'll have this wonderful life as a postal carrier with a family they love. But right now, they don't want any of that. Oh, kill me now if I won't be a rocker. Does that mean that death would actually not be a harm for them? And why would you take this myopic view of what their current desires are as opposed to what they would want in the future? This is the kind of thing that secular ethical reasoning can do, and I think that it can totally establish ethical claims and can totally show you some of the main things that I really admire many Christians for having insight on early, things like that infanticide is wrong and the least amongst us matter, and things like we have really strong duties to help others, that weak requiring force of beneficence thing, that actually is a standard that none of us can actually live up to, but we have to try. We have to keep approximating what there's most reason to do as best as we can. Now I could I would have answered, if I'd had more time, I would have answered the why be moral stuff. Why I care about what's right. I think there's a whole set of things. I don't think God helps, because if you have this crude theory where God just, you should be moral because God's going to give you a good afterlife if you do and a bad afterlife if you don't, right? That's way too crude. There are non-self-interested reasons. Surely Protestants can't believe that anyway. It can't be that. There are genuine reasons to, like Jesus saw, to help others for their sake and not just because it's going to get us something that we want. And the way you sort of, I think most of us intrinsically just happen to care about others, and we care about morality, and by figuring out what morality actually says, that can actually better, inform us of what intrinsically we want to do. But that's not the end of it. I think that when we reflect on our motives, we can sort of see that rational scrutiny supports some of them and opposes others, and things like compassion for others and feelings of obligation to help, to help others and not to harm them, those are the kinds of motives that are going to be endorsed. The vengeance feelings, I think, are the ones that rational scrutiny isn't going to be supported. It's going to be the, I think you're going to get the turn the other cheek stuff. I think rational scrutiny will vindicate that. And that's really important because that means you don't have to, convert people to your religion first to convince them morally.
Thank you. Wow.
Good stuff, right.
So we are...
Can I get my 1 minute, 90 second last
word? We're kind of out of time, but I'm going to pose one more question, and you can get in a quick response, Howard, and then respond to this question, and then you give a quick response.
Wow.
By quick, I mean like 1 minute.
With us two, you'll be very, very lucky. But
So here's the final question. I think it is important to come back to the theme of the night, which is vegan pizza, and the underlying moral motivation, which is concern for animal welfare, which I think is a very serious moral concern that's only really come on the radar for a lot of people since Peter Singer published Animal Liberation 41 years ago. So you can respond to Howard, but also respond to the question, why care about the lives of animals, each from your ethical perspective? And we can see this different approaches to ethical reasoning on the ground, but quick.
Okay, so let me try and do a 1 minute, 90 second response, and then animal rights and vegan pizza. So a couple of thoughts, and if I throw a few things out machine gun style, we can pick this up in the Q&A. I was interested, as you were chatting away there, Howard, I actually made an interesting comment on my iPad here. I said, it's interesting, you're using this phrase secular ethical reasoning a lot. I would want to really be strongly in favor of the position that as a Christian philosopher, the only reason we can reason, back to Raymond Tallis at the start, is we live in a world in which there is mind and consciousness. Those things actually exist, and they are an incredibly powerful argument for God. In other words, the only reason you can do secular ethical reasoning is because God has given us minds and we are using his tools, which are a great gift. One thing we haven't touched on, I want us to bring out in the Q&A if I get an opportunity, is the interesting question of why all this holds. Why is it human beings go wrong so frequently? One of the best ethical thinkers, atheist thinker on this is John Gray out of the UK, wrote a book, Straw Dogs. He's quite iconoclastic. He argues that things like secularism and humanism are actually a modern-day religious faith because there's no evidence for them. He's wonderfully iconoclastic. But I do think, I want to really stress that and this is where I'll end my response and then talk about animal rights. I think the question of goodness really is tied to the question of purpose. An illustration I often use with my students to illustrate this is if you were to come and talk to me after tonight's meeting and I happen to mention in passing I'm really cross today because and you say, why are you cross? I say, I bought a new watch at the airport and the jewelry store ripped me off. They sold me a bad watch. And you say, Andy, why is it a bad watch? You say, well, last night I was putting up some shelves and I tried to hammer in nails with my watch and I broke it. You would say, Andy, well, two things. You'd probably say, one, would you like the number of a good psychologist here in Edmonton? But secondly, you'd probably take me aside and point out that the purpose, the telos of a watch, is to tell the time, not to hammer in nails, and we determine a good watch or a bad watch by how well it aligns with that purpose. So there is actually a very strong connection between goodness and purpose that all of us intuitively get. But
and 10 seconds on animal
rights. Animal rights are hugely important. I do think, though, they supervene, they stand on human rights and human ethics, because at the end of the day, we don't look at the lion chewing the human being to death and go, naughty lion, I'm going to take you before the Human Rights Court. We do the other way around, and that oughtness gets pushed onto human beings. It's human beings who ought to behave a certain way to animals and not the other way around. And I agree, it flows out of who human beings are and our responsibilities and our duties. I don't believe animals have rights. I think that weighs is suicide and insanity, I do think we have responsibility to Howard, to animals. And I was going to say, I admire Howard for the vegan pizza.
I'm an animal too, in case you haven't noticed.
I was going to say, I admire your vegan pizza.
Yes, and
oh, what a Freudian slip.
No, it's fine. No, I am an animal, and I'm very happy to be one.
Good man.
I have no trouble with it at all. Yeah, so actually just to go in reverse, in fact, so I'm not entirely, I don't like to talk about rights ever, because I think it invites massive confusion. I totally agree that the real question is with non-human animals and with many other beings many human beings who don't actually have the ability to be moral agents. The question is about our responsibilities to them, and then of course things about their well-being and what harms them and what benefits them. So non-human animals are not the only creatures that are moral. The jargon is moral patients, beings who are owed something, but not moral agents, beings who have responsibilities. Young infants are like that. They don't have moral responsibilities. They can't tell right from wrong. And there are some humans who throughout their entire lives are like that, the profoundly intellectually disabled. And I think that it's nothing to do with biological species membership whatsoever. If there were psychologically identical space aliens to us who have the same kinds of capacities to do ethical reasoning, they're going to be moral agents. It doesn't have anything. If chimps get smart enough, eventually they'll be moral agents. It has nothing to do with biological species membership. But I don't like to talk about infants having rights. I don't really like to talk about anyone having it's not just like infants, they have a right to. So if it shakes its little fist at you, then you don't kill it, but otherwise it's cool. No, so I think rights is just the wrong foot to start on so many ethical issues. But I think that once you realize that sort of biological species is completely morally arbitrary, just like because when it's nothing but genotype independent phenotype or the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This is one of those things that when you actually think about what it is, it's just as obviously irrelevant as so skin color or as a result of ancestry or relative gamete size, sex, or what have you. That doesn't matter. They're not moral agents. The ones that around here aren't. But once you realize that we have the same kinds of strong duties not to inflict equally great amounts of harm on them and to confer equally great benefits on them as we would have, independent of its further consequences, as we'd have to any other being. Just like with infants, right? Maybe some things benefit and harm infants less than adults, but you take equally sized suffering, right? Equally sized harm like suffering, independence, further effects. Just as wrong to inflict that as an infant. We have just as strong a moral duty to infants not to inflict it on them as adults, and I think the exact same is true for non-human animals. So then just really quickly about this stuff, sort of the earlier more. Oh, by the way, let me just really emphasize, even if you don't agree with me about it, and I think this is clear, even if you don't agree with me about how strong our duties are to non-human animals, I think because of, if you just have minimal consideration for animals, and even if you just cared about humans and didn't care about animals at all, given the massive ecological consequences and bad effects on humans of animal agriculture, and given the massive suffering that, even if you didn't care about animals at all, there's still a very strong moral case to be vegan and try to be as plant-based as you can. And even if you, and certainly if you just, give some mere minimal, if you're opposed to dog fighting, if you're opposed to sort of deliberately inflicting cruelty, right? If the reasons are that strong, they also really strongly support being plant-based. So you definitely don't think you have to go nearly as far as I do for the basic, really strong priority of the case for plant-based diets. Okay, sorry. So to the other things.
30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. I guess you said right. So I'm not defending my. So again, let me just emphasize: metaphysical naturalism is not atheism. These things are distinct, right? You can be. I actually even think you could probably be a materialist and be a theist, and maybe didn't the Manichaeans try that? Anyway, don't worry about that. You can certainly be an atheist and not, like I gave the example of McTaggart. You can be an atheist. You can believe in non-natural logical facts, ethical facts, not that consciousness is not reducible to anything material. So you can have all that, even if you want to be an atheist. It doesn't depend on God. And then so this claim, like following Augustine, that it really helps if you say it all exists in the mind of God. I don't actually think that really helps, because we don't have any idea how that's supposed to work, how it's all supposed to hang together. You're just basically this is you're saying God does it, God somehow. How? We don't know how that works. We don't know how it's unified there. You're just using words.
Okay.
And so I think it would be just as well. I think I think it would be just as well, I'm sorry, I think it would be just as well to just say, look, we don't know, let's just admit ignorance. We don't know how it's unified. Or maybe it's unified in this Platinian one, but that's, there's no reason to think that that's, that that's God, that itself has mental states. There's no reason to think that that itself, certainly is the Judeo-Christian God. So I think, the reasons for non-naturalism really just don't in any way support theism. I think that that's a mistake. I think you actually have some pretty good metaethical views, even if you're not a non-naturalist, by the way, for people who don't want to go for non-naturalism. And again, non-naturalism in ethics, you can totally be a non-naturalist in ethics and a physicalist about consciousness, and lots of contemporary philosophers are, so these things are totally independent. And yeah, those are great philosophical discussions to have, but I still, think the reasons are clear to think that ethics at least just, the God thing is totally separate from that, and ethics just doesn't depend on whether there's God. Sorry.
Okay, it's 8:15. We've gone a little bit longer, but we're having such a good time. So, do you want to give an announcement? Okay, and we're going to take about 5 minutes before we reconvene. Keep an eye on that. 8:20, we'll be reconvening.
Good fun.